So my daughter lives in Columbus, Ohio, in a little house. It was a servant's quarter that was built, I don't know, 140 something years ago, and now it's her home. It's in an alley. She's the only house in the alley. Everything else is a garage. She is so proud of this house, so proud of it. She has just painted every inch of it, and she has planted shrubs, big flowering shrubs around it. And when I was there in June, in May, she had taken a lot of little zinnias, planted in the little Dixie cups, and we planted those zinnias, and I swear those zinnias are this big, and there are bumblebees and butterflies and maybe even birds in those zinnias. And then in June, it was time for the sunflowers that, again, she had grown in these little bitty Dixie cups. And those sunflowers, and I put a picture of it in Peace News, because those sunflowers, yellow and red and brown, all these colors I've never seen, I swear the sunflowers are this tall. I've never seen anything like it. And I'm always like, Columbus, Ohio, we should all move there. Everything will grow there. The earth is fertile. It's a great place. But to be totally honest, if you've gotten in a car and driven anywhere, there's a lot of sunflowers, right? Drive across Kansas, drive into Oklahoma, drive up to Nebraska, into South Dakota. I mean, sunflowers, they just sort of grow, right? Some of them just wild, and some of them are actually cultivated. There's sunflower seeds and sunflower oil, and they're just this incredible, remarkable plant. That's two different ways to read the parable. One is like, my daughter is so extraordinary, you should see her sunflowers. And the other one is like, you know what, sunflowers just kind of grow, they're kind of everywhere, right? I mean, that's the two different ways, and the two different ways this mustard seed parable has been heard, kind of, you know, historically more like it's the tiniest seed and it grows in this remarkable thing, and it's the kingdom or the kingdom of God, just this extravagant thing. And then scholars more recently like, you know, maybe the miracle here is just that it's everywhere, it's every day, it's all over. That the kingdom of God, the shalom, the peace, the joy, the blessing, the abundance, everything is just everywhere you look is this miracle. And I have kind of tended to go that way lately. Amy Jill Levine, she's a Jewish scholar who teaches Christian origins and early Christian scriptures at Vanderbilt. And she points out this text, you know, and Matthew, Mark, Luke all have it. You know, it talks about the mustard seed as the tiniest seed, but to be fair, it's not the tiniest seed. There are smaller seeds. It's a small seed, granted, and the parable is definitely about something small growing into something big, but this isn't a tiny seed that becomes the Yosemite National Forest, right? I mean, depending on which gospel you got, Matthew, Mark, or Luke, the little seed either grows to be a vegetable, you know, or a shrub that becomes a tree. I mean, it's something, but it's not just something you just couldn't even imagine. It's kind of, this is the way life should be. This is what God intends for each of us, for all of life, to flourish and to grow. And that's not to say that sometimes things don't thwart that growth, you know, that there's a vulnerability, and we know that. Again, if you've driven across this country this summer, maybe if you crossed tribal lands or reservations, you know, you saw kind of, you can take this stuff out of the kids' history books, right? You can't take it out of the truth. I mean, that people's land, their way of living was taken from them, and then they were forced onto land that was so barren that nothing will grow. You drive across and you see what? Just so much potential, young people, nothing to do, no opportunities, no possibilities. Meanwhile, you know, in our own communities, our own kids, you know, sometimes they're just, so much is poured into kids. It's like we're just going to squeeze every bit of potential, rushing them from one activity to another, right? It's just, it's almost like it's feast or famine when it comes sometimes to our kids. And you see that, you see the kind of results of that all throughout our economy. Even something as basic as the changing roster for the Major League ball teams, right? Like an average team, 40 average roster, maybe have one, maybe two African-American players on it. That's it. Because baseball has become so incredibly expensive to play, right? So you've got kids now, 7, 8, 9-year-olds who are already on traveling teams that their parents spend thousands of dollars a year. So a lot of kids just can't compete. It's not just like, you know, the way Major League Ball has changed in this country. You know, we see that kind of the way potential is missed, or the inequality, and it actually hurts all of us. There was an interesting op-ed last week in the New York Times, and the title of it was, "Why Do We All Feel So Insecure All the Time?" And it was written by a woman named Astra Taylor. She's just written a book. She's an artist, and she's a filmmaker, and she's a community organizer. And she starts the article off with kind of those statistics that we're now sort of used to seeing, talking about the inequality, the growing inequality. Since 2020, in the last 3 years, 2/3 of the wealth in this country that has been created has gone to the top 1%. I mean, we know that, we hear that, right? I mean, it's just blah, you know, we don't even think about it. And yet we know that there are huge ramifications to that. And that's kind of our point, that there's no top to how much a person can create, and there's no bottom either. So her reasoning about why, and I see it in myself, even those of us who have way more and plenty and we're secure, there's always that, there's kind of this little boat. For one, there's marketing people who are constantly telling us we're not enough, right? That we need to do something about this, and we need to do something about this, and we need to do something about this, and what we are is not enough. So there's this, you know, that's kind of in marketing. A satisfied customer is not a customer who buys very much, right? You want people to be unhappy and unsatisfied, and then they'll buy more. So there's that kind of like, we're not enough. But then there's also the reality that, you know, one giant medical event could take everything you have. And so part of what Astra Taylor is saying is this is an opportunity for us to think about a different world we want to live in, right? And we know it can be different. We grew up and it was different. When I was a kid, right, pretty much all of my friends, everybody owned a house by the time they were 25, right? And I've never had a day in my life without health insurance. And, you know, we see now, it's not the same landscape our young people are facing, but it's also different in other places. Joe and I went to Toronto last fall, and we did a graffiti walking tour. Everything I know about graffiti, I learned on that tour, right? I mean, I knew nothing about it, but it was a good way to see the city, and it was an art historian, art professor, and I learned, like, there's layers, like you tag, you put your name, and then you add these other things, and you do this other stuff, and it was really fascinating. It was really, we learned a lot about the city. But I also was like, you only saw like one, like here or there, like one reference to like Black Lives Matter or something. And we asked the guy about it. He's like, yeah, they didn't really have much protest art around here. And this guy's teaching young people, because he said, the young people here aren't really angry because everybody's just so well taken care of. That's not the United States, right? So we know it can be different. So we're trying to work. We're gathering signatures, as we're always doing, right? Raise the minimum wage, allow Missouri workers to get health care. But it's also like, as we try to work for a different world, as we try to elect different kinds of leaders and go in a direction where all of God's people can be sustained, we also look every single day at the ways we can nourish and sustain one another. You know, whether it's lead to read, or being a big brother or big sister, or caring for your own kids or your own family or your neighbors. Harvesters. I always talk about harvesters because I think, you know, and any of those of you in Zoom, every big city has their own version of harvesters. Every food bank, almost everything we support, underneath there is harvesters. You put in your zip code and you Google it, 145 places within 5 miles of my house that get food from harvesters. So I'm like, you know, you give a little money to harvesters every month, and every time that comes out, it reminds you, people are hungry today. There's somebody in the city who's hungry. But it's not just that. Potential is what you're funding. That is what you're funding. The newsletter this summer, it was like, you know, I've read it, I've reread it. It's just such a hopeful thing, but also shocking in some ways. Like the first picture, it's this woman, mother, 3 children, see her bright smile. She struggles to feed them. She loves being a teacher, but her salary does not earn enough to feed her kids. And granted, she's living in Amethyst Place right now, where Jimmy Holmes works, a place for recovery, moms and their families. They have a big food pantry there, supported by harvesters, where those kids can eat and flourish and their brains can be fed. And then the next one, another great story about Pride Haven, where young people who identify as LGBTQ, who are houseless, who are homeless, can go. You know, it's hard to get young people to come in and take the help they need and grow and find healing. And one of the things that keeps them there, enough to eat. A food pantry provided by harvesters, right? And then the very next program, it was about prosperity. You know, it used to be the Grooming Project, Prosperity at 58th and Truce. It's a place where mainly young adults learn to be dog groomers. You can make 35 to 70 grand being a dog. You know, pets are a big business, right? Pets are a big business. And it talked about too, like they have a food pantry there supported by harvesters so that people can eat fresh foods and also be trained to learn it. And the whole thing, right? It's all about nourishing and feeding, because part of the miracle of the parable is that the little mustard seed makes way more mustard than anybody needs. Like a mustard plant, a lot of mustard. I mean, you know, some people put it on, you know, everything like Mahomes and ketchup, but really mustard, there's only so much you can use, right? And that's the truth of us. We have so much potential that we can share. And the mustard seed is also curative. It's healing. It's a way that we offer and share and grow and give to one another. Demetrius Cunningham knows about that. My friend Suzanne Gladney, you all know, she's preaching next Sunday. She's our migrant farm worker person. I've known Suzanne for all that. She cuts and sends me newsletter articles from the New Yorker and the New York Times. Even still now, I have files and files and files and files of articles she has sent me. This one I have held on to since December of 2016. It was in the New Yorker. It's such a great story. My prison cell learning to hear on a cardboard piano. It's about this young guy, Demetrius Cunningham. The guy has just got so much potential. He has got music in his DNA. He says his body and blood is just filled with little quarter notes. As a little kid, he grew up, he was singing in the church choir, and then he played the xylophone when he was in 6th grade. He never had a piano, but his grandmother had a piano, and he remembered running along the keyboards when he was at her house. His uncle, who played jazz on some casino in Las Vegas, would come, and he would just listen and enjoy it. And now, you know, he's been at Stateville Correctional Center outside of Chicago for a good bit of his life, singing in the church choir. And then they said, we really need a piano player right now. And he wanted to be the piano player, but he had a challenge that he didn't have a piano. He could use the prison piano 1 hour a week, but he had to teach him. And he saw a show on TV about some great gospel singer who taught himself to play the piano by making a cardboard piano. So he decided that was the ticket. So he waited until it was toilet tissue day on Tuesday, and there were lots of cardboard boxes, and he got a big cardboard box, and he taped 2 sections together, and then he wrapped it in 10 sheets of white paper, and then he got a cassette tape player, and he carved out the little, the little white keys, and then used black construction paper to make the little black keys, and then he turned his bottom bunk into his prison, piano bench. And he sits on the little property bench that he has, and he needed books to learn about it. So his mother sent him books of scales, and at first he was frustrated because he wasn't learning enough. So she sent him books with chords and music theory, and he started playing. And he would practice, and he would practice in his head, and then he would go the 1 hour while he could play. He would be anxious and nervous, and sometimes he'd miss the keys, and so he'd play quietly so the voices would cover over him. But he just became this incredible musician who now writes his own music. And then if you visit people in prison, you know how it happens. Just you show up and one day the person's been moved. So he was moved south 4.5 hours to another prison in Illinois. And he showed up that day, and guess what? Saw a lot of people he knew from his own prison, but also they had a prison choir too, and they needed a pianist too, and they needed a choir director too. So he said he would take both jobs. That was a lot to do. So at the very first choir practice, he announced that there's a way to learn to play the piano on a cardboard piano, and 3 hands went up. So now he's also a piano teacher, right? Teaching people how to play the pedagogy of the cardboard piano. So much potential in every single human heart. My daughter walked out of her house on Friday. She was going to walk to the mailbox. She had a watercolor for Micah she had painted, and right there across her front porch was one of the giant sunflowers. I mean, I could, from this far away, hear her heart breaking. But the picture she sent to me was of her next door neighbor, Tom and Kathy. They've never had anybody live in the alley in their 40 years like Eden, who's having the whole neighborhood over today in her backyard. But the picture she sent, Tom, who's 80-something, who never had his own kids, is out there with a red pillow and like twine and stuff, like as Eden said, performing open heart surgery on the sunflowers to get them to stand up again, right? That's the nature of what we're called to. Take a little seed, throw it out, it grows, it flourishes, and at our best, we're like the little birds who go out on a limb to provide for ourselves and one another. So may this simple, small miracle remind us, right? Keep our eyes open every minute, everywhere, all the time, looking for the places that God's good gifts are coming among us. Amen.